Scott's already discussed with you BP's history of environmental neglect and unsafe work practices. And Pam just covered with you a basic timeline of the BP disaster itself and some pretty horrific images of the impact of the BP oil spill on the Gulf itself. And what I want to talk about is really some of the organizational and operational errors and really some of the things that the business and management within BP did wrong. And the first thing I'd like to go through is actually the use of the decision that BP made to use single-walled pipe, basically, as opposed to double-walled oil field pipe. And on April 14th, 6 days before the explosion, BP won approval from the Interior Department's Mineral Management Service for these permit changes. And basically what it did is allowed BP to drill the well with the use of this single-walled pipe, which was not resistant for gas and was basically not nearly as safe and not rated for the depth that the well was actually being drilled within. The second thing I'd like to discuss are lax materials testing by contractors and poor oversight by BP. And really what this deals with is the relationship between a primary company and their secondary contractor. And within this relationship, BP had the duty to maintain oversight of the smaller contractor and make sure that they were getting a quality product and quality material, and that's really what BP didn't do. They actually failed to authorize the concrete plug tests that were necessary to make sure that they were getting a good quality concrete and basically ensure that Halliburton was doing their job. And they actually cite the specific reason was that they didn't want to take the time to do it. And the third point in terms of operational or organizational errors that I'd like to discuss is that operators on the rig misread warnings. They redid tests and then they misread those retests. And there were a few people on the rig, as this little article cites on April 20th before the explosion, that had severe concerns about the tests being ruled the way that they were, being allowed to continue drilling. And a BP company man said that they needed to bypass the test and continue with the drilling operation. And really what this shows is that BP was complicit in the decision to continue moving forward on the Horizon oil well and was actually directly involved in the eventual explosion. The next thing I'd like to talk about is BP's misjudgment and some of the false assurances that they made us. First thing I'd like to say was that BP was concerned most primarily with profit over safety. They once again made the decision to use single-walled pipe over double-walled pipe simply because of economic and financial reasons. The second thing is that they chose to not test the concrete plug for the sake of time. And really what this comes down to is that the Horizon job was already over budget and behind the clock. And so by skipping those samples and double-checking the safety of that product, they made that decision simply to save money. Now the next thing I'd like to discuss is how BP used lies and spin to hide the severity of the oil spill. And some of the initial estimates show that BP said there was as little as 1,000 barrels a day leaking from the well, when we know that in eventuality, anywhere from 12,000 to up to 100,000 barrels of oil were leaking from that well every single day. And these misestimates led BP and the federal government to try some kill attempts like Trash Shot or Top Hat that really were not rated for that particular depth or for the severity and flow rate of that particular explosion. And so BP's misinformation really prohibited the federal government from accurately being able to respond to that problem. I'd also like to discuss how BP used new and untested dispersants in ways that nobody has ever used before. They were the first company, and this was the first case in history where dispersants were actually used at the well site. Where the well was purging from the pipe into the seawater, they put chemical dispersants on that well, which basically changes the specific gravity of it, preventing the oil from floating to the surface and allowing these giant plumes of underwater oil to drift aimlessly about the Gulf. And what that does is it keeps the oil from going to the surface and being degraded by bacteria and sunlight and by mechanical means, and actually basically keeps it in the fisheries and the habitat. And I think Matt's actually going to discuss some more of this with you guys a little bit later and some of the environmental impacts of the disaster itself. The next thing I'd like to talk about are some of the recommendations that we would like to make to BP, and really just some things that anybody who's in a business, who's in a management position should be thinking about if they run into a massive environmental situation like this. And my first recommendation is basically that BP or any company in this situation needs to be less concerned with the bottom line and more concerned with doing the job right. If time and money were not such a factor, the mistakes that were made wouldn't have been made. And like I cite here, lower costs drove the selection of the inferior pipe, the poor materials testing, and the decision to ignore the warnings were all led by money. The second point I'd like to discuss is that they need to promote, in BP and within other companies, cultures that promote safety and valuing the environment. BP needs to rebuild its corporate culture in a way that will embrace safety and embrace a love and compassion for the environment. The third point that I'd like to discuss, and this is probably the most important thing that BP really needs to do, or any company needs to do, is really when you decide to make an endeavor into an area like this, an industry like this, you need to have a coherent plan. All across the world, countries dictate the way that other companies come and drill within their sovereign waters. And the United States has actually very lax regulatory rules, unlike countries like Norway. And so BP had no universal drilling policy that would dictate their operations in every country across the world. And so they were basically allowed to defer to the most lax regulations whatever country they were in. And so they basically need to have an appropriate unilateral international regulation that governs their behavior in any country. And the fourth point is that BP needs to blend their current business strategy with a strategy that prioritizes safety and the environment. And really, since BP is the largest oil company in the world, if they make the safety changes necessary, if they embrace environmental friendly policies, other companies will follow.